search of their first win since 2021. A couple of opposing nicknames. We have the Gladiator Ricky Glenn taking on the Spartan Christos Giagos. And when you look at this, I mean, a couple of losses on the way for Christos Giagos. Arman Tsarukyan and Thiago Moises, those last two fights. And if you look at it for Giagos, both of those training camps taking place in South Florida at Sanford, aka Killcliff FC. And he moved over there after beating their guy, Sean Soriano. That's Giagos' last win. A couple of guys in their second stints with the UFC. And it was Giagos losing the first round and coming back strong in the second round. And Giagos is one of those guys that the cardio is kind of up and then it's down, and he fights at a really high pace. And I'm going to talk about an interview that he did with one JHK with the All-Star MMA as we move along. But for Ricky Glenn, radio silence since the last time that he fought against Grant Dawson. Lost the first round, lost the second round, got held down. In the third round, came back. He nearly finished Grant Dawson. It was a 10-8 by all accounts in that third round. So that is why it's a draw on his record. Ricky Glenn, World Series of Fighting featherweight champ. He was a big underdog in his breakout performance against Gavin Tucker in the UFC. And that's kind of the craziest part about this fight. This is how I'm going to hand it off to you. Best version of both of these guys. I'd say for Ricky Glenn, it was that Gavin Tucker performance. It's in Canada. The scorecards, 30-25, 30-24, 29-27. He was a plus 275 underdog against Tucker, and Joe Rogan was singing Tucker's praises as Ricky Glenn was beating him down. But the worst version of Ricky Glenn, I have two versions. One against Miles Jury, and one against Angel of Death, Kevin Aguilar, where Aguilar right hand drops Ricky Glenn in the third round. All 6 scorecards, 30-27. So, best version of Glenn beating Gavin Tucker with the boxing and the overall skill set. Even Ricky Glenn's takedowns. But against Aguilar, he just couldn't really figure out the distance and he couldn't really get his boxing going. For Giagos, best version, I would say, against maybe Damir Hadzovic or Carlton Minus, making it gritty, working in his takedowns, threatening kind of all over the place. But the worst version, I mean, you go ahead and pick one. Like, it's a rookie. Against some of the better fighters, that's where Christos Giagos has fallen off.
I get told this by a basketball coach, and I think about this in MMA all the time, even when I break down fights. I get told by a basketball coach, if I give you 20 shots, how do you take all those 20 shots? And you have to think, right? Like, that's a lot of shots to take. Like, what spots would I be in? I think about fights all the time where it's like, okay, if you give the fighter the exact positions they want to be in for all 15 minutes, how would the fight look? I've talked about this with Joanne, formerly Calderwood, now Wood. It's like, hey, if the fight goes exactly to game plan, it's probably going to end in what? A split decision, right? Because a lot of the fights are close. For Christos Giagos, I think about his pacing in this way. If you give him 15 minutes to hit the bag, your first 9 minutes are going to be absurd. They're going to look so nice. But the problem is, he's not going to be able to pace himself and envision those last 6 minutes to really matter, even when he's hitting the bag by himself outside of an MMA match. If you give Ricky Glenn 15 minutes to hit a bag, steady. Just, it will never change. His pacing will not change. And that's why I think pacing in this fight is really going to be the key for both guys. Because I think Giagos does burn a little bit hotter early on in the fight. And that might mistake you into thinking, oh, Giagos is kind of the more high volume guy out of the two. And it's not that he doesn't have good volume at all. That's not the point I'm trying to get across. But he does have high volume early. And it diminishes as the fight goes on. So I think for Giagos, it's weird to say this, but I do think it will be a key to try to bank those first 2 rounds. And I know we'll probably talk more about the grappling in a little bit. Giagos does have more grappling, I would say, in his back pocket, at least at the offensive variety. He has submissions and a lot more sweeps off his back, but Ricky Glenn has that consistency with his striking that can give Giagos a lot of issues.
Glenn's one of those guys that for the longest time trained at a Team Alpha Male, then he made the move back home to Iowa. I mean, Robbie Lawler's home. A Killcliff guy with Christos Giagos, but he's now out of absolute martial arts and fitness, and when you look at it for a guy like Ricky Glenn, he was off from 2018 to 2021 due to major hip surgery. So he comes back, takes on Joaquim Silva. That right cross was the money, and he was able to drop Silva twice and get that finish win. And then again, against Grant Dawson, struggled with the takedown defense round 1, round 2. Round 3 was a fresher fighter, and he got the win. And Giagos was originally supposed to take on Benoit Saint-Denis back last year. He was forced out of that fight, and out of the interview that he did with JHK, he was pulled from that fight because he was remodeling his house, and the family was supposed to come over. And I'm paraphrasing as I tell the story. Go watch the interview. But he was cleaning the house after he, remodeled, and they had taken a toilet out. What happens when you take a toilet out? sometimes you drop it, you get a little bit of porcelain. He had some in a garbage bag and he went to pour that out, and just a sliver of that porcelain came out and severed 2 tendons on his pinky finger. So he had to kind of go through the rehab. Back in December, he was hitting the bag at 100%, getting ready for this fight. You look at it, and if you do consider it, like, it's interesting. He's trained with a lot of southpaws at the gym. Killcliff FC, so many great training partners over there. The Michael Chandlers of the world, and so on and so forth in these lower weight classes. But if you consider it, I mean, against a guy like Arman Tsarukyan, first round, defends the takedown, digs up, and gets a takedown out of his own right before he ends up getting finished. Against Thiago Moises, Moises just kind of jumps out, grabs the back up against the cage, and gets the submission win, gets that tap. But for Yagos, like, even the minus fight, Burns really hot, gets some really good takedowns.
Do you think the last fight for Ricky Glenn against Dawson is a good precursor for this matchup? Because, again, you're fighting a guy who's dangerous on the feet but gets a lot of his work done on the mat, and you realize, okay, even if I lose the battle early, I can still win the war as the fight progresses. I think that kind of a matchup will be a confidence builder for Glenn.
It's got to be, there's a little bit of confidence, I think, for a guy like Yagos, because he was able to step in on 3 days' notice and replace Ricky Glenn against Carlton Minus to get that last win. So you got that one over him a little bit. I think the southpaw stance from a guy like Ricky Glenn, although you train with southpaws, Ricky Glenn trains with orthodox fighters all the time. They do always have that slight advantage to southpaws. When I look at a matchup like this, Christos Yagos has decent boxing, and it's always been the part of his game to me that's kind of had to come along as things have progressed. I know he had a really kind of knock him out, drag him out type of fight against Oliveira in the first round when they fought. You know, Charles. And then in the second round, Oliveira is able to go out there and get the finish. It's just, Yagos, put the skills on a board. Is he a better wrestler and grappler? Yeah, I'd say so. Is he a better striker? No, because he leads with his chin out all the time in his fights.
The TJ Brown.
And he leads with his chin out. So Yagos could struggle in some of those in-betweens. That was kind of my big point in this fight. So if I do look at this one, Matt, I struggle with the pick a little bit. Ricky Glenn's a pretty big favorite. That's what kind of scares me out of it. And the odds have shifted. Glenn opened minus 225. He's a minus 200 favorite right now. We have a look at the Tapology vote. Surprise to us, there to you. Long layoffs when you're 34 aren't good.
True.
So, and for Ricky Glenn, his last time out against Grant Dawson was a year and a half ago. I'm going to say over under 70% Ricky Glenn.
I think it'll be under.
It's going to be under. It's over. 704 total votes. 87% Glenn. 76% by decision. For the 13% that have Yagos, 70% by decision as well. So a couple of finishers at lightweight. People think it's going to a decision. What do you make of this one?
I have Ricky Glenn ever so slightly, though. I don't love the odds on this matchup whatsoever because I think it'll be a close fight, and I really do think the cardio of Glenn is going to be important because Yagos could easily win those first 2 rounds. And if you're admitting that, then you openly admit he could win the matchup easily by decision or either finish too. But I do think the consistency of Glenn is going to shine through in that 3rd round. I know he didn't get the win over Dawson, but that was really impressive to see him be able to shine through and carry his power and output into the 3rd round. I share your sentiment and worry about his injuries and the layoff, and that's why I say ever so slightly, but the pick is going to be Ricky Glenn.
I'm really eager to see these two guys weigh in, especially, and if it does go late, I mean, I do ever so slightly favor Ricky Glenn. Like, he's pretty tight with his boxing combinations. I mentioned it earlier on, in tight space. Kevin Aguilar was able to land kind of like a, not to discredit him, but it seemed like kind of a pedestrian right hand, and it dropped Ricky Glenn, and then Aguilar was able to capitalize off of that. I'm going to go with Ricky Glenn ever so slightly, but the underdog pick in Christos Yagos with those takedowns and that work rate in the motor, you might really like Christos Yagos. And in the headline of JHK's interview with the All-Star, it's Christos Yagos versus Ricky Glenn matchup, severed pinky tendons, and Islam Makhachev title defense. And he really likes the fact that Ricky Glenn's one of those guys at lightweight that you have to watch out for. Both of us in the matchup going with the Gladiator, Ricky Glenn. Let us know down below in the comment section who you have. Some big fights left on this card that you're not going to want to miss. Keep it locked in with Fight Night Picks. We always say, let's get into it.